Thank you all for coming to my talk titled Teaching Social Justice and Anti-Racism to Elementary Schoolers Through Project-Based Learning. So for some background about me, I have attended and taught at both public and independent schools. And my teaching background is actually in teaching Arabic as a world language. And now at Trū, we have mixed grade classrooms. So I'm actually teaching a classroom of 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders. So when adults talk about large concepts like anti-racism and social justice, we utilize very complex and specific vocabularies. We speak from lived experiences, and we also speak from learned knowledge. Children have yet to develop this sophisticated ability to talk about such complex topics. So, how do you teach children about such complex topics like social justice and anti-racism in a way that they can understand? Walking into a classroom full of 3rd graders and saying, "Hey class, today we're gonna talk about anti-racism. Here's the definition," that's not effective. And it doesn't really work, right? It's not effective and they're not going to understand what you're saying. So at Trū, we teach about these large concepts by following a unifying theme that rotates annually. So the themes are beginning, living, and becoming. And this year for 2020 to 2021, our theme is becoming. So every year before the school year starts, teachers take the theme and we create 3 grounding projects to go along for the theme. And those projects last the whole entire year as well. And so our projects for 2020 to 2021 for becoming are called People, Survival, and Inventions. The guiding questions that we're using to guide us through these themes are: how do we remake the world through developing technology? How do humans create a livable environment? And how can we create a world in which human differences are accepted? So these themes and these questions are broad by nature. We make them that way specifically so that we can explore a host of different topics and different activities over the course of the year. So they're broad because we don't want them to be so small, and so that we can investigate many different things over the course of the year. So for example, this year, we've looked at equity in healthcare during the pandemic. We've actually looked at statistics. We are going to look at how electric cars are changing the world. Like, how does the invention of the electric cars and other really cool technology, how do those technologies have the potential to change the world as we know it, as we are living now? So that's something else we're investigating. And we're also, right now, we're looking at the impact of the civil rights movement going from the history all the way from the Civil War until the present day. Examples of projects we've done every year. So we create 3 different projects each year, and it's my first year at Trū, but here are some examples of projects that we've done in past years. So one project is called the Mother, Daughter, Sister Project. And it was a project that investigated how the lives and perceptions of women were changing. How are the roles of women defined? And what were wartime responsibilities for women? And an activity that the students did in this project was they interviewed all the women figures in their lives, like their mothers and their grandmothers, and they got to ask them questions, and it was really cool. Last year, they did the City Project, which looked at differences between East Palo Alto and Palo Alto, and we looked at statistics like salaries and then salaries based on race. We looked at housing and who lives in a bigger house or who pays more rent. And we also looked at who who rents versus who buys a house, and how do people decide who to rent houses to, and things like that. And that project culminated in the students building a city together inside the classroom. So something we do is we also create authentic experiences for the students to really experience, to really, I guess, have meaningful experiences as they're going through school. So today is a great day to give you the election simulation. And so that was back in November. We did a week-long learning experience. And basically at the end of the week on election day, students would vote for one of two fictional stuffed animals to become the president of Trū School. Well, what happened on election day? Students, they all lined up. There was one ballot box, and students lined up at the ballot box, and some students were told that they had to go to the other ballot box. So there was a teacher with a map, and there was kind of like a path, and there was a red X on the map. And the students, along with the teacher, kind of wandered a little bit and tried to find where the second ballot box was. And when they got to the place where the X was marked, the ballot box wasn't there. There was actually no second ballot box. So then by the time the students came back to campus where the actual box was, it was too late to vote. The polls were closed and they couldn't cast their ballots. Another thing students experienced was that some people, when they got to the ballot box, they had to answer questions. Questions like, what is 2 + 2? Easy. That question was answered and the student dropped their ballot into the box. The next question that was answered was something like, how far is the Earth from the sun? And the student, was not able to answer that question. I don't even think I could answer that question if asked on the spot. And so the student was not able to drop their ballot into the box. They weren't able to cast their ballot. And our students online, so we're teaching kind of in person and online at the same time, as I'm sure many of you might be familiar with. So our students online had to follow a very specific set of instructions for their absentee ballot to count. It had to be filled in, sent to a specific email address by X time on this date. And if all of those parameters were filled, then maybe their vote counted. So at the end of the week, when we announced the winner, one candidate had 3 votes and the other candidate had 1 vote. And you could hear the reactions of surprise from the students because, we have more than 4 students at Trū. And so it was evident that, like, oh my God, I don't know if my vote counted. What? And then some of the older students were like, I couldn't even vote. Like, this is not fair. I am so mad. And what we did with this emotion and with this experience was we specifically announced the winner at a time when the whole school was gathering, so that we could have a whole school discussion about voting and their experiences and their emotions and what they felt. So essentially what we did and what we do at Trū is we create authentic experiences tied to our projects and current events to help students understand that there are so many ways in which people walk through this world, but people can have dramatically different experiences even for the same thing. Like checking out at a grocery store, that experience is very different for one person than another person. And so if we had everybody drop their ballot in the box, on election day and simply counted majority rules, and we said, this candidate won 51% of the vote, so they will be the fictional school president, that wouldn't be very representative of the decades of injustices that Black people and women and other groups have experienced and fought for, especially in the United States, for equal voting rights. And so we wanted to create a meaningful experience that wasn't just like, let's have everybody vote, but we wanted to create an experience where people would be able to understand the significance of voting in America. And so in your classroom, some things that you might want to think about while you're lesson planning is that when you're lesson planning, how can you make lessons across all subjects that tie into the theme? And I'll talk a little bit about this in a bit. And the other thing is, while you plan your curriculum, think about who is being representative and what perspectives might be missing. How can you incorporate those perspectives into your curriculum and into your lessons? So I'll give you the example of the Titanic. So here's a little bit about how we integrated the subject of the Titanic through all of our topics. So there we go. So for science, we talked about the boat itself, the process of sinking, right? Like what happened, the boat sank, how did it sink, water temperatures, and body temperatures. In English, we were reading stories about the Titanic. In social studies, we read and the students heard first-person narratives from people that had been rescued from the Titanic. So they got to hear from people who were there, like, this is what my experience was like. And in math, something you could do is create simple math problems based on the Titanic. But how do we teach about anti-racism and social justice when teaching about the Titanic? So when you have a topic or when you have a theme, how do you teach about anti-racism and social justice with that? And so through studying the Titanic, we also studied the people on the boat. There were 3 classes on the Titanic, first class, second class, and third class. So what did that mean and who was in those different classes? When the boat began to sink, who had a higher chance of survival and why? Who survived? How? What stories were there? And how did what happened on the Titanic change the future of ships? So if I got onto a ship today, which I don't recommend, but if I did, like what would be on that ship? What safeguards would be in place? How did the Titanic impact the current day industry of large boats, right? And so how are we impacted by what happened? And so by asking and investigating these questions, students are able to explore subjects in really nuanced ways. By studying the people, they learned about social structures and how people were treated differently based on certain factors. Something else we do at Trū is we have and we showcase really authentic representations. So we have a really diverse community, and often we'll have people in our community who celebrate different holidays and traditions come to speak about them and show us how they're celebrated. And by doing this, we are exposing students to people who they might not otherwise be exposed to and learn about traditions and celebrations in a really authentic way. We also use diverse picture books, and for the Electoral College, Grace for President is a great book, highly recommend it. It's a very complex topic. And when I say that we use diverse picture books, I don't always mean that we're reading books where the main character is a person of color and the whole book is about that experience. Incorporating diverse picture books into your curriculum is something you can do, but it also doesn't always have to be about race, right? Or it doesn't always have to be about the defining factor that the character is like different and how they integrate into society. So it's also really important when you're reading diverse picture books to just have that representation for the students, because students need to see people that look like them, and also they need to be exposed to people that don't look like themselves. And especially in an elementary school classroom, that's a great way to start exposing them to that representation. And so, in conclusion, and then I'll take some questions, but incorporating themes and projects into your curriculum does not have to be large scale. I know I've talked about it a lot from a top-down scale. You know, we kind of planned the year out at the school that I'm at, and then we we kind of fill the pieces in as the year goes on. But you can even take a topic or an idea, something that you are already going to teach about in your classroom, and then you can spend lots of time with that. You can think about that topic or that idea or that historical event thematically, and really integrate that into what you're doing for a week or even for a whole day. Something else that is helpful that I've mentioned is that when planning your lessons, what perspectives do you have? What perspectives are missing? How can you include these into your curriculum? So the great thing about teaching elementary school, which doesn't really exist when you're teaching Arabic or like a less commonly taught anything, is that you can go on the internet and you can search for topics, and you can search for ideas and examples and resources, and you can get resources and you can find things that teachers have already done, and you can modify your lesson plans, but you can also see how people are teaching what you will be teaching. And maybe they'll have perspectives that are missing. Maybe they'll have something you hadn't thought of that's really important. But how can you include these into your curriculum? And my third point is just, how can you create experiences for the students that mirror the real? I talked a little bit about our voting simulation, and that was kind of like a real-time example of how we were mirroring the real world. But how can you create experiences for the students that mirror the world in a really accurate and authentic way? So I invite you all to think about those questions and those points. And I've talked a lot, so now I'm curious to hear from you all. What questions do you have? And I'll try my best to answer them. You can either type them into the chat, or you can just unmute yourself. And I will stop sharing my screen.
I have a, oh, sorry, Erica, were you gonna? I have a question.
Sure.
I'm wondering if certain topics are specifically about one group of people and you have students in that class who are a member of that community, how do you avoid either ostracization or, you know, maybe the natural inclination for young kids to be like, oh, like so and so is Black and we're talking about slavery? Like, how do you cautiously approach those conversations that are obviously still very important to have?
Yeah, thank you for that question. We really make sure, so we think about everything we do really, really deeply. We spend a lot of time not only planning our curriculum, but collaborating amongst teachers to make sure that what we're doing is really thorough and accurate, but also doesn't, you know, ostracize or other anybody in the class. And we acknowledge that, like, even amongst our population, you know, so let's say I'm Korean American, and if there was another Korean American person that I was teaching, their experiences would be very different than mine. And so we are really cautious about, that like single story narrative. And we are very thorough in our curriculum planning. So I don't know if that answers your question, but there are definitely like safeguards in place, and we are thinking about that a lot because that's the last thing you want, especially for an elementary schooler.
Yeah, my question was a little bit similar. Simulations sometimes make me nervous. I was thinking about when you're talking about the voting one, like, did the black kids just happen to be the ones that got the hard question? And if the white kids got the easy question, and how that could play out. I don't know if you did it randomly or thought about it, but yeah, that worries me to if it's supposed to sort of mirror real life or if that happens.
Yeah. Well, we spent a lot of time on the voting, and it kind of came together very fast, but all of those questions that we asked were kind of random, and something that really helped was that the students didn't know if their votes were counted. And because of the way that we announced, like one candidate got 3 votes and one candidate got 1 vote, and we have more than that students, there was just like no way to know who had, like, whose vote was counted. For the one where they had to go a little bit off campus and follow that map, I was in charge of that. So I made sure that the students, those were the older students, mostly like the students that were having that experience, would be able to kind of process that experience. And they wouldn't be totally blindsided, because it really wouldn't be fair to have, a 4-year-old like go find a box and find out that that box wasn't there. Awesome. Are there any more questions? Yeah, sure.
I'm curious how does the school kind of present this to like the families or like the greater community? And do you get like pushback at any point, and how do you deal with it?
Yeah. So this is my first year at the school, and I forget what it's called, but the day where we're presenting our curriculum to all the parents, right? Like back to school night is usually some version of that. One of the parents, like you are talking about big topics. How can you make sure that the students, how can you make sure that the students are not going to be kind of blindsided by these really big topics, and they're going to understand and digest what you are, what you are teaching about? And so I kind of gave them a little bit of what I talked to you about here. And especially for things like the election simulation, and if we do other kind of sensitive activities or experiences, we'll be sure to let the parents know, usually beforehand or while it's happening, just so that they kind of have a heads up if their child comes home and is like, I had this experience at school. But we make sure that all of the things that we're doing are really carefully thought out and well planned, and all of the contingencies that we can think of have an action plan for sure. I just remembered that day, it's called True Learning Day. So yeah, thanks for your question.
I'm curious, what are some of the contingency plans that you've made?
Well, I think that's a strong contingency plans is a strong phrase, but usually it's really just like communication, right? Like being very open and honest with communicating to the parents that the students had this experience, being prepared to talk about difficult subjects. So that means that the teacher has to do a lot of research beforehand. Even when kids like ask questions, sometimes, it's like totally out of the blue, and you have to be prepared to, answer these questions. Or just having, so like having really authentic and honest conversations. And sometimes when students ask something that might catch you off guard, or they share something and it is tied to identity, or it's tied to an experience that they've had, and you don't have the right answer, I've certainly been like, you know what, like, I need some, like, thank you for sharing this with me. I need some time. Let me talk to the other teachers, and I promise to get back to you in, you know, child-friendly language. And that's helpful too, because then the child feels seen and they know that you are advocating for them with this tough experience that they've had. So I found that helpful. Awesome. Well, I don't see any more questions, but so I think I will end here.